to Southern Sense Talk Radio with your host, the radio chick, Annie Ubellis. Join Annie on Tuesdays and Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time with an open chat room full of her regulars. And yes, you can even call in. Call 917-889-3675. That's 917-889-3675 to be a part of the action on the phone line. Not able to listen live? Not a problem. You can always catch Annie, the radio chick, and Southern Sense Talk Radio podcasts in archives at southern-sense.com. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Southern Sense the right way.
You're here listening to Southern Sense here on Blog Talk Radio, High Plains Media, SHR Media, Kinetic Hi-Fi, The Fix FM out of Charleston, South Carolina. Also sitting at number 16 of the top 100 conservative shows on TopTalkRadio.com. I'm your hostess with the mostest, the radio chick, Annie, and we're back. We're back, along with my co-host, Curtis C.S. Bennett. Good afternoon, Curtis. Happy New Year. Last time we spoke.
And Happy New Year to everyone out there. It's good to be back.
Yes, it is. And just bear with me because I'm a little bit discombobulated today. So what else is new? We got ourselves two great people that are going to be joining us for the entire show. So we're going to have a lot of fun here. We're going to have Vlad Tepes. His website is vladtepesblog.com, along with Kel Fritzy of Red Fox Radio and Global Patriot Radio here on Blog Talk Radio. So we're going to have a great time. I want to remind everyone that if you are calling into the show and you want to participate, please take your index finger and press it to the number 1 on your keypad, and we will know that you're asking to join the conversation. Otherwise, we'll assume you're listening. So sit back or relax and get ready for a wonderful show. And we'll also want to say hi to everyone that's finally showing up in our chat room. They must have missed us because it's been quite a few shows that we have not been here, Curtis. Quite a few. So it's going to take me a few minutes to get back into the rap and rock and roll.
Well, we got a lot to rock and roll about, especially all the rocking and rolling that's going on in the nation's capital with the Sessions review there. We got all these liberals popping out of nowhere, disrupting the hearings. So hopefully we can get that under control.
Well, we'll find out what's happening because I caught a little bit of it going on, and some of it's kind of a little crazy out there. So we'll see what's going to happen. Right now, today is Jeff Sessions, and they're really going after him. And we do have Kel with us, so let me just bring her in. Kel, good afternoon, sweetie. How are you?
Hi, Annie. Hi, Curtis.
Hey,
yeah, I just posted a link in the chat room about Jeff Sessions' confirmation hearing. People running around dressed as KKK and, oh boy, protesters being kicked out. Oh, what's going on down there, you two?
You have to wonder how they got in there with those costumes. They're supposed to have good security.
Yeah, that is a good question.
Exactly. Good point.
Yeah,
and they would be checking that facts.
Snowflake alert, snowflake. It's snowing in D.C. I caught a little bit of Senator, oh, God, what's that guy from Jersey now? Cory Booker. I caught a little bit of him. And, oh, man, I wanted just to slap him around. You know, out and out lies. Good Lord. The poor guy. But, you know, he's going to get confirmed. All they need is a simple majority. So, you know, this is all for show. It's show and tell. And how much more FaceTime we can get on TV. You know, you think about some of the good guys that have been out there that fought the fight. And Curtis, you sent this to me, and I want to thank you. A friend of our show, he's been on several times. Matter of fact, we were trying to get him here to South Carolina to do a rally, and it didn't work out, unfortunately, last year. The father of Niger Innis, Roy Innis, has passed away at the age of 82. And you sent this to me from the Washington Times, Curtis, and we'll do a little mini dedication before we get into our regular dedication. But the Washington Times writes, civil rights icon Roy Innis, who for over 50 years in public life confounded stereotypes and the conventional wisdom of politics, had died Sunday morning in New York City after a long illness. He was 82. Roy got up every day and followed his conscience on what he thought was right, and if it led him to collide with political correctness, he was willing to take the heat, said Wayne LaPierre, a longtime Innis friend and CEO of the National Rifle Association. A tall, muscular enigma wrapped in a conundrum, Mr. Innis was noted for being a compelling speaker at the podium, but otherwise mild-mannered, except when he wasn't. He knocked Al Sharpton out of a chair and onto the floor during a TV debate, and he clobbered a white supremacist who called him an Uncle Tom on a Geraldo Rivera TV show. He believed in self-reliance, humility, and the courage to fight for expanded opportunities, not for dependence on welfare, said Ken Blackwell, a former Ohio Secretary of State and domestic policy advisor to the Trump transition team. He wasn't a pacifist, as Al Sharpton and others found out. His initial support for black separatism evolved into a libertarian conservatism not remotely shared by other famous U.S. civil rights leaders. He had headed the Congress for Racial Equality since being elected to its national chairmanship in 1968. My brand of conservatism is the traditional, most decent and rational expression of the American personality, he once told the New York Times. I believe that the success of America has been the application of pragmatism in society, and that view is particularly unfashionable in the civil rights movement. People who praised Mr. Innis did so at their own risk among black politicians and other civil rights leaders. Rudy Giuliani got pummeled by black leaders in 1994 when, as the mayor of New York, he said that an Innis dinner was probably the most significant Martin Luther King celebration in New York City area. Yet it got no coverage in the press. Mr. Innis was used to absorbing punches from an indifferent or outright hostile press in New York and nationally. In his athletic prime, he was considered one of the top amateur boxers in the country. His ability to win the respect of people across the political spectrum and from the entertainment and sports world was something to behold. If you've never been to one of Roy Innis's annual core dinners in Manhattan on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, here's what you missed, said Wayne LaPierre. 3 rows of head tables filled by cops and politicians from all 5 boroughs. Every sitting mayor, I mean from Ed Koch to Rudy Giuliani, you'd see famous singers from the Metropolitan Opera, boxing impresario Don King, former heavyweight champ Evander Holyfield. Roy pulled together the most eclectic groups you have ever seen. They showed up as much out of respect for Roy as for CORE. At these dinners would be seen Laura Bush, Jane Fonda, Peggy Noonan, Ted Turner, George W. Bush, Howard Cosell, Muhammad Ali, Charlton Heston, Usher, Morgan Freeman, and Barry Manilow. To a seemingly inordinate extent, ordinary people who knew Mr. Innis was and what he stood for, even though he wasn't a professional athlete or entertainment figure. The coat checkers and servers at these dinners were excited to see Mr. Innis as they were to see any of the celebrities. When interviewed, they explained that he belonged to them. My man, Roy. One day in New York, a cabbie picked up a reporter and Mr. Innis. The driver recognized Mr. Innis and told him, "Sorry to intrude, but you've always been an idol to me." The cabbie then went to his truck and proudly pulled out a painting of Mr. Innis, apparently being routinely carried around. Mr. Innis's transformation to a kind of libertarian conservatism that was, in its various parts, unique to him, came from his own personal experiences in the streets of Harlem. drawing his own conclusions based on what he thought would make things better for people. I think of the courage it took for him to move from left to right. As the liberal community turned its back on this icon, says Mr. Blackwell, he really did walk a path of independence and courage. I once asked if he had advice for young people on how to live their lives, Wayne LaPierre said. He said, he tells them to believe in TLC. Truth, logic, and courage, and you'll be okay. And that summed up Roy. That's why so many people loved him and will miss him. That was a mini dedication to Roy Innis. You're here listening to Southern Sense here on Blog Talk Radio, High Plains Media, SHR Media, Kinetic Hi-Fi, the Fix FM out of Charleston, South Carolina. We're doing things a little bass-ackwards today, but for those that listen to the show also know that we do a regular dedication to a fallen hero. And although Roy Innis is a fallen hero, today's dedication is dedicated to New Orleans police officer Jude Williams Lewis. His end of watch was November 8th of 2016. And I seem to have lost my dedication music. Things are, like I said, a little upside down today. Here we go. This is from the Officer Down memorial page, which really doesn't tell you all that much of this officer. But it reads, Police Officer Jude Lewis succumbed to his injury sustained on June 1st, 2001, while responding to back up another officer who was involved in a foot pursuit. His patrol car left the roadway and struck a tree near the intersection of Washington Avenue and Pine Street. He suffered a traumatic brain injury as a result of the crash and remained in a coma for 6 months afterwards. He never fully recovered and was unable to speak or walk. He succumbed to complications of the original crash injuries on November 8th of 2016. Officer Lewis was a U.S. Army veteran and had served with the New Orleans Police Department for 3 years at the time of the crash. He is survived by his sister. And there was not a lot written about Officer Lewis, and it was hard to find much in the archives. But this was from WDSU.com, written by Casey Ferrand. The New Orleans Police Department buried an officer who survived a crash on the job more than 15 years ago. Officer Jude William Lewis, a U.S. Army veteran, was laid to full military and police honors, and his relatives said his death felt like a second loss. The day that crash happened, it was devastating for the entire family, said Lewis's youngest sister, Denise Lewis Crawford. She still remembers vividly the night of June 1st, 2001, when her brother's police cruiser was wrapped around a tree after he lost control while chasing his suspect. Lewis suffered traumatic brain injury and fell into a coma for 6 months. It was just a total loss in itself. Even though he survived it, he was just never the same thriving Jude that we knew. He was no longer able to speak, and he was no longer able to walk, Lewis Crawford said. On November 8, 15 years, 5 months, and 7 days after the crash, Lewis slipped away, leaving the family that faithfully cared for him to mourn another loss. It's like there's no coming back from this point, because at first, when he was in a coma for 6 months, of course we sat, and we waited, and we prayed, Lewis Crawford said. The family does take comfort in knowing that the man they saw as a fearless protector and faithful fighter lived a life dedicated to service and sacrifice in the military and on the police force. Lewis enlisted in the U.S. Army shortly after high school and served in Desert Storm. He was stationed in Germany and was on active duty until 1994. He then enlisted in the Army National Guard Reserve and was stationed in New Orleans until 1999. In September of 1998, Lewis joined the New Orleans Police Department, or also known as NOPD. 3 years later, he was involved in the crash that forever changed his life. When we sign up for this, we're not signing up for a job. Although it's a great career, it really is a calling, because somewhere in the back of your mind, you're accepting that I'm going to serve others. I'm going to serve people that I don't know, at risk of possibly being injured and at the risk of possibly even death, said NOPD Superintendent Michael Harrison. Even 15 years after the crash that took him away from his call to duty, Lewis is remembered and honored for giving his all. We never forget, and we wanted to remind this family that his name and his memory will be inscribed in our hearts and will go down with the people who served this community and served this city well and paid the ultimate sacrifice, Harrison said. Lewis was buried with full military honors and with full police honors at the Southeast Louisiana Veterans Cemetery in Slidell, Louisiana. Today's show is dedicated to Police Officer Jude Williams Lewis, whose end of watch came on November 8th of 2016, more than 15 years after his original injury. His family lost him twice. His community lost him twice. We lost him twice. Today's show is dedicated to all those brave men and women who serve as first responders, who don their uniforms, step out their front doors every day, never knowing what they will face or whether or not they will return home. We also dedicate it to all the brave men and women in the military who serve this nation to protect us and our liberties. And we dedicate this song by Dave Bray, Last Call. God bless them all. Hi, is this Vlad?
Yes, it is.
Were you playing the drums?
Pardon me, what's that?
Were you playing the drums?
No, I was typing. Sorry, can you hear this tapping?
Yep.
Do you hear that tapping?
Yes.
You do?
Yep.
Okay, great. So that's good. So the right microphone is on. Does it sound okay?
It sounds excellent.
Great. So we're good to go.
All right. As soon as the song's over, I'll bring you on live, okay?
Okay.
and that's Dave Bray, Last Call. And you can get his songs and his music by going to DaveBrayUSA.com. Check it out. We're back here. This is Southern Sense here on Blog Talk Radio, High Plains Media, SHR Media, Kinetic Hi-Fi, The Fix FM out of Charleston, South Carolina. Also still sitting number 16 at the top 100 at TopTalkRadio.com. I'm your hostess with the mostest, the radio chick Annie, along with my co-host, the one, the only, the ever so knowledgeable and prolific author Curtis C.S. Bennett. And also check out his website, which I always forget to talk about, theoriginalradicals.com. Curtis, we've got ourselves a great show and great guests. Are we ready to welcome them? All right.
Just going back to Roy Ennis real quick. When you mentioned him on the show with Geraldo, I remember watching that, and I believe that's the show where somebody threw a chair and broke Geraldo's nose.
And he deserved it. Oh, yes, and he deserved it, rightly so. I do want to make...
I think that was the beginning of the Jerry Springer era.
Yeah, it probably was. But before we bring our guests on, because we've got Kel Fritzy of Red Fox Radio and Global Patriot Radio. We also have Vlad Tepes, VladTepesBlog.com. But I want to make one small comment because there are a lot of people in the chat room asking about my husband. Thank you. Yeah, he is making progress. I actually had hoped that he would be home today. And when he called me saying they're writing discharge papers, I'm thinking, oh, my goodness, he's coming home today. And I was running around the house just getting things in order, making sure he could get around without bumping into stuff with the walker. And unfortunately, instead, they're moving him to another facility today to do rehab. It is a step forward, but not the one we expected. So I am heartbroken that he's not going to be here with us this week, maybe another week or two. They're saying anywhere and possibly 2-4 weeks. I won't know until I go back later on this afternoon, and I'm sure by then they'll evaluate him. But thank you for your prayers. It's going to be a journey. It's a long journey, but it's not a path that God said that we couldn't walk, and we'll walk it, and we'll come on the other end. We'll be all right. We'll be all right in the end. That said, I want to thank everyone for that. So, Curtis, I'm going to start crying in about 2 seconds. You better greet our guests and bring them on for me.
All right.
All right. I'm back. Okay, I'm back. And we've got with us, I want to welcome aboard Vlad Tepes of Vlad Tepes Blog. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show.
And you're a frequent guest of our friend, my sister from the other mother up north, Kel Fritzy. Kel! Oh, it's going to be one of those days.
Mr. Vlad Tepes, how are you today? Annie, it's always one of those days.
That it is. Geez. But, Vlad, you have a rather interesting blog that you go after the snowflakes, you go after the left, you go after the media, you go after, and I won't say radical Islam, I'm going to say Islam, because Islam is what it is. It's a wonderful thing you do, but why did you stick your neck out to do that?
So, thank you very much for that question. I don't get asked that much. And it's something that I think goes to the heart of this issue. And a number of years ago, I actually had a career in performing arts, and I enjoyed it, and it had all the benefits of a career in performing arts, although it certainly didn't make me wealthy, but I enjoyed, making a living at something that was a great deal of fun, to which I had some skill, and it came with some of the other trappings and benefits of life in performing arts. And I noticed over the course of time that there was a disconnect between what people thought, what the media reported, and what I saw at my window. And the more I looked into it, the more concerned I became about that disconnect, that there was seemingly a kind of organized disconnect. There was something distinctly different between what I observed, and if I applied what I observed to rational analysis, as opposed to what it was I was constantly hearing from everywhere. So I started to research it in my own sort of clumsy way. And I started out by cutting my teeth, kind of debating people in for people who remember IIRC, I think it's probably still very popular, International Relay Chat. And I went to different chat rooms there, Delnet, especially Christian Debate and so on. and I met some really brilliant, some really great people, and learned, how to debate and how to critically analyze things. And eventually I thought, I'm going to start a website to try to deal with some of this, because there was really something terribly wrong. And if you go to, for those who are interested, first of all, it's Vlad Tepes, Tepes blog.com. If you go, you'll see in the different headers at the top, one of them is agendas and views of the site, where I tried to create an actual template through which you could attack, criticize, or approve of the site. At least you'd understand what the purpose of it was, and where I was basically saying that there was a threat to classical liberalism, and I consider myself to be a liberal in the Thomas Jefferson tradition of liberal thought, what I call a bad libertarian, if you want, and a conservative-leaning libertarian, and that the idea was that if we did something about this disconnect, there appeared to be a problem with Islam and with leftism, as I saw it at the time. Not recognizing, it took years to sort of understand the depths and the perniciousness of this plan, that in fact there is a very distinct and well architected plan by Muslims and by far leftists to join forces to take down classical civilization. And it's a process to get to that. If you start out telling somebody who's still not red-pilled, as they're starting to say, right? You're definitely going to be written off as a conspiracy nut. But as time is going by, those layers are coming down. It's becoming more evident that this is the case, and it's becoming easier to red-pill people. Anyway, so I started the site because I felt the cost of not doing it was greater than the cost of doing it. And initially, again, as it says in the agendas and views of the site on that page, it says the idea is that back then when I started it, roughly, 2008, I think, maybe a little earlier, the idea was that had we kind of woken up as a society at that time and just re-entrenched our own values as a democratic society and not broken our own laws to give special advantage to groups that want to damage us, we could have solved all these problems with no bloodshed and with a few strokes of the pen. Like get back control of your immigration, get rid of special advantage to certain groups like Muslims or whatever have you, get rid of what I didn't know at the time was cultural Marxism, weed that out of the system and go back to a nation of laws and reason and Greek thought. We could have gone to that at the time. It wouldn't have been too difficult, and really this problem would have gone away before anybody knew it was there. But like any problem, the longer you let it go without dealing with it, without an attempt at fixing it, the more draconian the solution has to be. I liken it to cutting your finger and not getting a Band-Aid, and then getting an infection and not putting a poultice on it, and then getting your hand infected and then not taking antibiotics, and then getting your arm infected and then getting gangrene. And then, at each point where you choose to treat it, the solution is more and more unpleasant. And I kind of think that we're at a stage where there's really no way to solve this problem that's going to be nice. I think the rot goes deep, and the infection is profound, and there are places that are gangrenous, and amputations are going to be required. And I got to tell you, that feels especially bad because of the reason I started my site, which was let's restore liberalism, as opposed to, again, I didn't realize it at the time, but as opposed to cultural Marxism, and let's fix this problem, let's nip it in the bud. Perhaps I'm deluded, though. Perhaps it was much worse than I thought at the time. But anyway, does that give you a sense of it? That's basically why I started it. There was something radically different between things, how things looked out the window and how they looked on TV.
Well, it's funny because I think that's why the rise of the Tea Party community here in the United States came to be, because a lot of us saw that the problems that were not being solved, they're getting worse and worse, they're compounding, and our voices had to be heard. We had to put out there and say, stop, enough is enough. Let's start taking a look at this with logic, cool logic and reasoning. But this is not what happened. We were told to sit down and shut up. You're bigots, you're Islamophobe, you're homophobe, you're racist, you're this, you're that. And instead of having a dialogue, an equal conversation, two groups sitting down at the table, exchanging ideas and finding common ground, one side told the other one, sit down and shut up. We're the minority and we're going to rule you no matter what we say, what you say. Because we are the protected class, we will have the final word, so tough luck.
Well, yes, although I mean, yes, it's exactly that, and worse and more so. Cultural Marxism, of course. I mean, the trick is here. It's the, you know, Alinsky really wrote it pretty well in a couple of his books. He explained it pretty well. If you study the Frankfurt School, it's all going to make good sense. But the whole trick is that to control the language, and by controlling the language, you control the public. And racism, of course, is one of those great. I mean, you initially start out with a rational definition of racism, where people say, yes, that's reasonable. I think that liberalism does require equality of opportunity. And then as that becomes accepted, then the notion of not being with racism, this is actually what okay, this is going to be a little weird. I tend to think of this as what I call the tragedy of the commons of intellectual property. And what I mean by that is that you have what is forbidden in terms of what you can say and think, and what's allowed, and what's just impolite. And so one of the tactics, I think, of the far left, of course, when I say the far left, I may as well be saying Islam, because, you know, as not Sirhan, as Carlos the Jackal said in his letter to Obama, the only way to take down the United States and classical civilization, parenthetically, is a combination of Islam and Marxism. And of course, he was right, and I don't know why he said that to Obama. Obama already knew it, was already doing it. I guess that's why he wrote it. But so we're clearly seeing that this combination of Islam and cultural Marxism in the guise of things like Black Lives Matter and, you know, J Street and feminist groups, none of which actually represent the groups they claim to represent, but usurp the moral authority of those groups to use them as battering rams against us, against classical civilization. And, you know, we're seeing, I think I've actually drifted myself away from my original point. But what was that thing you asked me again? What was that last thing you said?
Well, you know, I will make a comment here, because if you notice, Islam has aligned itself with two political ideologies that have similarities but yet are different: fascism and socialism. And in each one, government becomes the religion. And in Islam, government is the religion. And that is why they are able to adhere to both political philosophies and use them to their ends, to convert, divert, and conquer, basically.
So precisely. And the funny thing about that is, when I first started doing this and looking at this, again, from a fairly naive point of view, the only tools I really had was classical thought, logic, reason, right? So I didn't have the benefit of an understanding of this from an academic point of view. Who are the Frankfurt schools? Didn't know. I just kept looking, going, you know, on the surface, leftism, actually this brings me back to my point. On the surface, leftism and Islam seem to be diametrically opposed, because leftism claims to be the vanguard of the rights of disenfranchised groups, whereas Islam, of course, is a supremacist ideology which intends to destroy every outlying group. It intends to subjugate women, kill the Jews, destroy the Christians, Hindus, whatever have you, anything that isn't Islam. It has a very clear hierarchy. And the funny thing is that actually leftism really is that way, that it's a lie that it is defending the rights of women, because these feminist groups which started out perhaps initially, the suffragettes, for instance, who modern feminists don't even know what a suffragette is. But the suffragettes started out looking for classically liberal values, or goals, I should say. So they wanted the right to vote and equality before the law for women. Okay, this is an ostensibly noble goal. No one can see a downside of that. It happened, right? And then, of course, and actually this brings me back to tragedy of the commons of intellectual space. What happens is you keep twisting the definitions and using these tools and using the inertia that these initial groups created, whether it's, you know, anti-slavery groups, right? And you have the suffragettes, and you have all these groups that are, like, for instance, Jews in Canada, until well after the 1950s, there was a quota on how many could go to universities, right? There was an upper limit. You could only have McGill would only accept so many Jewish people in the 1940s, I think up to the 1950s. If you were Jewish, you would be actively filtered out. So it wasn't based on merit. And so the classically liberal point of view is you should let merit be the only thing, right? Which is, frankly, it is. There has been no greater civilizational force than the merit principle. I think that's probably absolutely true. If you If you were to create institutions of state and of commerce and say that the only thing that's going to matter is your merit, and the merit will be determined by rational means, you will have a society that will produce unfathomable wealth, and it will be wildly successful, and you will end up with a racial outcome in the sense that certain gene pools, certain genetic groups will dominate certain fields, and other genetic groups will dominate other fields depending on, that's just a fact that can't be avoided. But that's not racism. Racism is, if it's true, it can't be racist, right? So determining what's true is the tricky part. But the point is that what the left did is they...
I was just going to make a comment. When you say that a certain group of society will end up dominating one field of endeavor, that explains Hollywood, doesn't it?
Well, actually it does. It also explains stock trading and explains sports. I mean, see, this is it. If you look at the left, which is actually trying to destroy the social order, right? They listened to Reagan and said, he's right, let's do the opposite. Right? Let's destroy the family. Let's destroy even sex roles and invent a word gender. In fact, they've been so successful that I even hear classical liberals and right-wing people use the word capitalism, which I find nuts. Capitalism is a word that Marxists invented to describe free market economies. And a free market economy just means what happens when there's freedom. People value their own work, and then they trade it in a public space based on how other people value it, and you come up with some median figure, and it works, right? But capitalism was a way of demonizing it, and we even use those words. I find that quite common now, that those of us, even on our side of this, end up using leftist language to describe ourselves and our worldview, and as a consequence of which we're kind of letting them win. Like it makes it more difficult for us to take back. So the left has incrementally changed the definition of things such that it's now racist to think that white people have the same right to exist and the same right to the benefits of their own work as any other group does. And that's so that's what I mean by the tragedy of the commons of intellectual space, is that you start out with a reasonable thing, like women wanting the equality before the law, and then you go to what we have now, which is where if you're a divorcing couple, there's no point in the man going to court at all, because the judge is going to find in favor of the woman no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the history is. It is now completely sexist. I mean, actually, it's kind of turning around a little bit in Canadian courts, but basically the courts are heinously anti-male, and thinking that to not be so is sexist, see? So to be not sexist, you have to be sexist. And people use terms like reverse racism, for instance. There is no reverse racism. You're either for racism or you're against it. And I know people that make their whole lives of being anti-racist, yet they're for affirmative action. And when I say to them, if racism is discriminating against somebody because of their race, then how can you be discriminating against a person and then claim to be not racist? Affirmative action is just a leftist way of being racist without using the word. And so that's what happened, is that these concepts that initially started out to be rational and useful and good tools toward achieving liberalism, the inertia of these movements was usurped, was totally hijacked by Marxist groups that they knew what they were doing. And like the Muslim groups, Muslim Brotherhood franchises, there's got to be 150 of them. They know what they're doing, and they have hijacked the inertia of these groups, and they've moved it now in such a way that we are backed into a corner. If you try to say something reasonable, I mean, just true, you're guilty of a crime. What used to be impolite is now criminal because we abandoned that space. Each time that rational people say, okay, well, we get that this offends you, so we won't do that to be polite, the law moves forward from the left toward the middle and makes that thing which you did simply to be respectful now makes it illegal.
Go
ahead, Curtis.
My question is, what's up with Muslim men and their treatment of women? It's almost like they hate women. I know the concept of love in our culture, but in Islam, there seems to be no such thing as love between men and women. It's almost as though women are property of men.
Well, that's exactly what Churchill said word for word almost. He said in that famous quote that everybody's seen 100 times that comes from his book, The River Wars, the line about women is that all women must be the absolute property of some man. And so Churchill noticed that in the late 1800s. So, and the fact is that the slave rates, I've got to recommend this. It's something I try to get people to be aware of whenever I write or do a radio program. There's a movie that was done, I think, in the 1930s in the United States, and it was called, I'll come back to that. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with names.
We all suffer from CRS. You know what CRS is.
Exactly. That's I have that. I have that in spades. CRS I can remember. So I think the movie's about a story that was true story that happened in 1909, and it was where the American government sent a number of soldiers to the Philippines to train the locals, the villagers, how to defend themselves against Muslim slave raiders that were going into villages, killing the men, taking the children as janissaries, and raping the women. And they just carry the women off as sex slaves for their harems. And so what I'm saying is the American government as recently as 1938, 39, when they made this movie with Gary Cooper, of all people, and it was called The Real Glory. That's it, The Real Glory. And you know what? That movie is available in its entirety for free on YouTube right now, right? So for those who want to watch it, The Real Glory, and it's about the Philippines, and it's like kind of a popular movie. You can tell that it was made. It's not the greatest movie Hollywood ever made, but it did have a good cast, Gary Cooper and other people, and. Again, it's a true story which depicts Islam accurately. And there's a scene in it, I think the movie was made in the 30s. I'm not really feeling bad about a plot spoiler here, and this really isn't a plot spoiler, but it's one of the central features of the movie that make it worth watching. And that is where a commander comes out, and he says to the people that he's training, these Filipinos who are really afraid of the Muslims, because the Muslims appear in numbers from the sea and from the jungles and just take the women and carry them off, killing the men. They're brutal and ruthless, and as immoral as they are today from our point of view. And I say from our point of view because they believe in the Quran and they believe what they do is absolutely moral. Like the left, it's a complete moral inversion. I think that objectively, by the way, as an aside, it can be proven that Judeo-Christian morality is objectively superior, and the proof of that is that we produce more for more people, that we have better lives, that we live in safer communities, and that, it can be objectively proven that our ethical set actually is objectively better, and it's worth fighting for. And that we allow anybody to participate who wants to. It's not tribal. But anyway, back to the story. So this commander comes out and he says to these Filipinos, "You're afraid of these guys, let me show you who they really are." And he has a prisoner that they caught brought out. And he orders the prisoner to be wrapped in pigskin, and then explains he's going to be shot. And the prisoner suddenly goes from being brave and stalwart to going crazy and screaming and crying and begging for his life, and then offers all the information they want. Because his fear of being buried in a pigskin was that the advantages of dying a martyr would be gone. Now, I don't know. It's hard to know whether or not how much truth there is in that, but let's say that it is true. It's interesting that Hollywood was aware of that at the top levels. And now, of course, well, I don't have to say it, right? Now it's anybody who does a film in Hollywood that represents anything truthful is simply, these people will be blacklisted. There's another movie available on YouTube, was made about 10, 15 years ago, and it's called The American Carol, and it's with a few Hollywood conservative actors, James Woods, who's one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter, by the way, and Leslie Nielsen. And this is, again, fairly recent, 10 or 15 years ago. And this movie was done, it's a copy of A Christmas Carol, right? It's a rewrite of Dickens, but it's about July the 4th. And they deal with Islamic terror quite a bit in the film, and it's a comedy. And so I don't know if any of those people have worked since, right? That's how bad things are. McCarthy, I don't know if he was right or not in the 50s when he was accusing Hollywood of being commie, but my God, we need to find 10 McCarthys right now. It is really crazy how far to the left this thing has gone. But anyway, I guess the point is that, yeah, we really did have a sense of what Islam was really about for most of it. It's just the left has managed to expunge that. We're not allowed to talk about that. And as for Islam's hatred of women, okay, so they clearly see it differently. They have, it's hard to tell with Islam whether they're using taqiyya, a rhetorical device of deception, or whether they really believe what they're saying, because sometimes they really do, right? A lot of the religious Muslims will actually believe things that we are horrified by and have trouble believing that they believe, right? So, but as to their hatred of women, they most decidedly have a model of what women are and how they should be treated, which is anathema to classical civilization. And the problem is that it's functional in that if you can enslave women and make them have children and make them responsible for all the work, then the future is yours. And this is what they've done. And it puts us in a position of having to make strategic decisions.
Well, it's interesting because you had areas in the world of Islam that were more westernized. They weren't as conservative in their Islamic beliefs, and they were able to coexist for a long time with Western civilization and Christianity as well as Judaism. But with the surge of these radicals, as they want to call them, or as you say, more orthodox Islam, that has been pushed aside, and what once was a moderate Muslim no longer is. And yet they will not speak out against their loss of life and freedom.
So this is now, perhaps somebody listening wants to call in and correct me on this, but the way I see it is that Islam was extremely consistent from Muhammad's time up until the end of World War I. It was about total global manifest destiny for Islam. It was exactly what we see in that movie, The Real Glory. It was about slave raiding for sex slaves and children for janissaries and killing the men and making all religion for Allah. It was about plunder. It was essentially if you took pirates and you mixed them with the modern mafia and then you made it a religion, that's what you've got. I think what happened was after World War I, when the West had about enough, and remember, up to that point, over 1.5 million white people had been taken by Barbary pirates from the shores of northern European countries, Scandinavia right up to Ireland, had been taken as slaves, and Europe had a culture of being slaves. It was really quite something, And, of course, we're not allowed to talk about that in the modern terms because it takes away moral authority from Africans who were taken as slaves. But it needs to be understood that that both those things probably had a lot to do with Islam. So certainly in the case of white people who were taken by Barbary pirates. Now, over the course of after World War I, when we fought back and we pushed the Muslims back into the Maghreb and into the Middle East, and then we imposed our will on much of it. And we colonized these countries. And that was a good thing. It wasn't just good for us because it stopped this Muslim manifest destiny, but it was good for them because we actually made them productive, peaceful people. Their populations increased because their food supply increased. Their food supply increased because the methods of agriculture came from classical thought, came from reason and science. And so perhaps foolishly, we offered them all the benefits of classical civilization, but not the foundational thinking. And when I say foundational thinking, it should be understood that to this very day, it is the Al-Azhar University, which is the number one institute of Islamic thought in the world. Stephen Coughlin says that it's Harvard, Oxford, Yale, Cambridge, and the Vatican all rolled into one. And times 10. I mean, it is the single most important, but there's no number two. There's number one, and then it starts again at 12, in terms of how important Al-Azhar is. They will not teach philosophy, and they say specifically that they won't teach philosophy because philosophy creates critical thought, and critical thought is a threat to faith, you see. So we did not force Islam to abandon its religion and its religious foundations, which we really should have. But we gave them the benefit of classical science, classical thought and science. And so for about 100 years, it was, as you say, that Islam seemed reasonable and Muslims seemed to be, and then we could create this narrative that Islam was just another one of the Abrahamic faiths. I don't know if we were trying to sell that to ourselves or to them at the time. But now, once the left convinced us that colonization and colonialism was bad, which, by the way, there's one African nation that English escapes me, but there's one African nation that's begging for the France to come back to take over again because things were just objectively better. And I have a feeling that most Zimbabweans would feel the same if the ones who can remember what it was like when it was called what it was before it was Zimbabwe. Anyway,
Cal has a question for you. Go ahead, Cal.
Sure.
Hey, Vlad. It's interesting that you chose Vlad Tepes as your blog name. People don't really understand exactly who the historical Vlad Tepes was. He's known as Vlad the Impaler, and he was modeled as a character in Bram Stoker's novel. But people just see him as a warlord. They really don't understand the history of Vlad Tepes, the person himself. In my humble opinion, I really do think that he was probably one of the most influential counter-jihadists.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, people in Romania, if you could talk to them and show that you know something to the point where they trust you a little, will tell you, in fact, that Vlad Tepes is pronounced, in their language, it's pronounced Tepes, T-E-P-E-S-H. It's spelled T-E-P-E-S, though, Vlad Tepes. And he was known as Vlad Draculia because his father had been brought into the Order of the Dragon, which is Draculia in Romanian. Anyway, the fact is, yes, he's known. Westerners, because of Bram Stoker's book, think of him as Dracula. But the fact is, and actually the funny thing is that the legend of Dracula, as Bram Stoker wrote it, and the truth of Vlad Tepes, who was, when you say counter-jihadist, well, if only we could be that effective. But he was somebody who actually, his country, he was taken as a janissary as a child, first of all. So just to be clear on what that is, his father was made to give him up as tribute with his brother Radu to the Muslims who had been slave raiding Europe, raiding it for treasure, raiding it for sex slave, and raiding it for children, to be turned into soldiers and also as sex slaves. Because remember, I think the Quran says 3 times that their version of the afterlife offers them young boys for their pleasure, fresh as pearls. It says that 3 times. So to be clear, the rape of young boys as sex slaves, if you see, which is a central part of it's what they do instead of TV in Afghanistan. That's a central dogma in Islam. So let's not pretend it isn't. And they were, Radu and Vlad were given up by their father as janissaries to they called the Ottoman Muslims then, we call the Turks now, which were the head of the Islamic Caliphate at the time, right? They were the Islamic State at the time. And what's interesting is that modern movies, the newest of them that I've seen is called The Real Dracula. No, I will get that title for you too. It is an absolutely fascinating, wonderful movie where they mix the legends. They actually kind of have the monster aspect of it and the supernatural aspect, and they've mixed it with the fact that he was defending his people against Islamic invasion. And there are scenes where you see them invading, holding up the banner with the Shahada on it, and they just show it for a couple of seconds, but it's there. And Kel, do you remember the name of that movie? I'm pretty sure we might have even seen it together. Anyway.
I think it's called Dark Prince.
No, it'll come to me. And I'll look it up during a break. And the real Vlad Tepes, though, escaped and went back and took the throne of Romania, which had been usurped by corrupted nobles who were just paying off whoever was around, mostly Muslims, in order to gain power. Does that sound familiar today? I don't know. Like, I'm thinking this, as a Canadian, it might sound familiar. So he took the throne back and knew who he was fighting, and he used extraordinarily draconian means to stop the constant raiding of treasure and of women, of children of Romania, and defended his people. And the modern Romanians, like I say, if you can get them to trust you enough to tell you what they really think, and this is true for most Central and Eastern Europeans, because they know the West is at this stage in some ways more communist than they were when they were behind the Iron Curtain, you know.
Well,
but go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish. Go ahead.
So he ended up doing things which were historically really, really horrible, but they worked. And you know, when you're facing an existential threat, when for a century or 2 centuries or more, you had Muslims wandering into your country and taking whatever they wanted and abusing you at that level, I frankly think that when you're defending yourself existentially, you're justified in whatever you do. And what he did was he had his own army, which he raised, go into the countryside where there were groups. Now, the way it worked with the Muslims back then was when they, like in Constantinople even, and in these different cities and villages, when they raided them, is they would, individual Muslim in their army would go in and flag a home. and which meant that the booty, it worked like the mafia. Like you could rape the women and take them as sex slaves and the children's janitories, but you had to kick up 10% of whatever you took to Mohammed or the Caliph who represents Mohammed. That's why the religion almost fell apart when Mohammed died, because the whole thing was based around kind of a mafia-like system of kicking up to the captains and then the captains kick up to Mohammed, you know? So they would flag a home and they would take their stuff. And the Romanians had had but enough of that. So Vlad would send out actual scouting groups and they would take sleeping Muslims who were getting ready to go raid a town or a village or some homes. And he would have them impaled on large sharpened stakes in geometrical patterns around towns and cities in a forest, so that their comrades, when they were on their way to do a slave raid, would be walking past wriggling, impaled former comrades of their own. And that did serve as a deterrent. But as far as I'm concerned, the only really bad part about Vlad Tepes was that he ultimately failed, that the Muslims overwhelmed us, and they eventually took it. So I don't know when Romania actually managed to go back to being a Christian nation. Keep in mind that Romania initially had become Christian because it was persuaded to. Christian missionaries, with the way they thought and what they had presented, they had converted to Christianity. And it was not forced on them. And Islam is always forced on all people. Even Saudi Arabia, even the first Muslim city, which was, Yathrib, which was mostly at least half a Jewish city, had Islam forced on it. And by the end of Muhammad's life, the entire Arabian Peninsula was Islamic, but it was because it was forced on them. It needs to be understood. It's a rather critical distinction.
Yeah. Curtis, go ahead, and I'm going to take a break.
Okay. Islam's goal is to spread itself worldwide. And when we look at the things that Obama has done, as far as bringing in all of these refugees and letting people go from Gitmo, do you think the election of Trump will kind of like put a damper on this influx of Muslims into this country?
So it gives me a tremendous amount of pleasure to say this. I had my doubts when Trump was first running. I was a Cruz guy, and the reason is because Ted Cruz was trying to get a bill passed at that time, which would have reopened the Holy Land Foundation trials and would have reintroduced all that evidence Obama had locked up, which proved what the Muslims and Muslim organizations in North America were really doing. And it was also part of the bill to make the Muslim Brotherhood and all of its subsidiaries into and make them actual terrorist groups, like listed as terrorist groups, which would have given the United States the tools it needed, its various agencies, would have given it the tools it needed to really fix this problem without shooting anybody. I mean, you know what I mean? It would have been almost a kinetic-free solution. And I was all for Cruz because the fact that he was doing that showed he really knew what he was talking about. And I didn't really, Trump didn't talk to the public at that level. He wasn't talking to the public strategically. He was talking to the public in ways that would get him elected. And then, so I wasn't that sure about him, but I was happy about it. I wasn't against him, but my preference was for Cruz because of what I knew. And then once Trump got elected, I started looking at the actual decisions that he made in the public and the rumors that he circulated. And I thought not only did he know as much as Cruz, but I thought he was probably going to be about 15 times more effective. And even some of the little things he's done and said, the whispers he's done, one of the things he did is he asked for a complete list of all of the people who are at the top of an organization that Obama created, a new bureaucracy that Obama created called the CVE, as Charlie Victor Echo, stands for Countering Violent Extremism, yeah? And the CVE narrative is a postmodern idea. This is real classic Alinsky-type cultural Marxism, or Marxist thought. That predated even Michel Foucault from France. The idea of the CVE is you make a moral equivalence between two things which really are not morally equivalent, right? You say, okay, well, Adolf Hitler killed people, and if if a doctor pushes too much morphine into a very eternally ill person who's in pain, he killed people for the same, so why not support Hitler? I'm using a really extreme example to quickly illustrate how this kind of moral equivalence works. It's what I call intellectual sleight of hand, But the CVE does that. It tries to make Muslim terrorism equivalent to joining the U.S. Army and swearing an oath to defend the Constitution with force, and therefore you're a violent extremist like a Muslim terrorist is, so I support one more than the other. Now, Trump actually asked for the names of the people at the top of this organization, and I am going to make an educated guess at this because he's intending to either make it ineffective or better dismantle it completely. So if the question is, will Trump be effective at dealing with this? The answer is, if he's able to do the things he's clearly intending to do, or it looks like he's intending to do, he'll be phenomenally successful and in such short order that most sleeping people will still claim there was never a problem and still not like Trump. Now, having said that, I think that Obama, who's now building himself a bunker, he's putting up a wall around his new office complex, is planning to set up a shadow government. And that shadow government is going to be effective because he got to where he was by what he loosely calls community organizing. But if you have a good look at what that is, it's a lot of really hardcore, nasty, dirty politics. The same way he got to be, was it a senator in Chicago?
Yep.
He got to be there because he went out with the public, he made public the sex life of the person who had been his predecessor in a way which everybody, there's nothing involuntary about it. There was nothing awful about that man's sex life. He didn't rape anybody, he didn't hurt anybody, but it was something that Obama knew, even though everybody else in politics knew this guy was a swinger and his wife was a swinger. Everybody else knew it. Obama used that to get this guy out, get himself in. So we know what we're dealing with there. So Obama is going to be doing the same thing to try with his friends, very powerful people. George Soros, who's like, if there was ever somebody who the TV should go all fuzzy when they're on it, it's George Soros. I mean, that guy is. I don't think that DC Comics ever thought of a supervillain that would be that effective. So Obama's got quite a cabal of people, and he's clearly going to be setting up his shadow government. Front Page Magazine, and Daniel Greenfield, Front Page has written about it. A number of other people have as well at this point. I think that Obama's a genuine threat. He's going to make it much more difficult for Donald Trump to be effective. But I suspect that Trump, having come from New York real estate, is probably up to the challenge.
Do you think that the American people are the ones that turned this around? Because I know in the mind of liberals was the Russians, and I think one of the reasons why they want to blame the Russians for their defeat, because they cannot believe that the average American citizen that live in the Beltway and the Bible-pumping South defeated them. I really think they have problems with realizing that because they think we're ignorant. So do you think they're turning towards the Russians as an excuse for why they lost? So, where it really fits in, that's with the people.
So this gives me a chance to mention something I was hoping to get to mention anyway. Thank you for that question. First of all, I agree with you, but I also think it's the lesser element of why they're bringing this Russian factor in. Last night, I work with a team of really, really great people. So I'll name the ones that I can name. Gates of Vienna, and I work with him every day on a number of different projects. And mostly what we do is we look at foreign news videos that are interesting, especially from Europe. And we have teams of translators who are all volunteers, and many of them give all of their free time to us. And we find either articles from foreign news or we find videos. And the reason we do this is because Europe's news is tomorrow's newspaper for us, although that's catching up really quickly. So, but I think it's very unwise for us not to read. If someone offers you tomorrow's newspaper, it's really unwise not to look at it. So at least you can know if you should at least, fight, run, hide, right? So every day we subtitle videos, Hungary, France, Germany, especially Germany, Austria, Switzerland. And last night there was a really interesting a press scrum with Bashar al-Assad in France, who went to speak with some political senior people. Now, al-Assad, I've now watched a number of interviews with him, and I find him to be one of the most reasonable politicians ever, right? And Really quite an extraordinary guy if you listen to him. He's very, very reasonable, direct. And we subtitled, he was speaking in English, but the questions were in French, so all we really had to do was subtitle the questions. And that's up at, I'm not sure where you can find that video. I know you can find that video at my YouTube channel, Vlad Tepes Plug on YouTube. You can find it actually, and I'm going to suggest people go to therebel.media, and you'll see that interview up there. But the reason I suggest you see it at therebel.media is because the comments that were put under it were by people who really know what they're talking about, and they're exceptional. And one fellow who calls himself Bravo Zulu actually lists Assad's entire history. He was an optometrist in the UK and never wanted to be a leader. And his brother died, I think, and he had to come back and run the country. And he was running it as a secular liberal democracy, and he's loved by the Christian minority who he has protected. And he was keeping out all the pernicious Sunni Muslims, this whole jihad mentality. He was keeping it out, and he was running the country. He modernized it. He brought water to everybody, raised the quality and abundance of food. I mean, he's an extraordinary guy, right? So you've got to wonder, why are the Americans so determined to get him out? And in this, he says a couple of things. I don't want to, spoil the whole interview, but I think one of the things that he says that's really interesting is if you want to know what's true, he said, you must listen to alternative media, because all of the legacy media is absolutely telling the opposite of the truth. And this is demonstrably true, what he says. I mean, the gas attacks were done by American-backed Sunni jihadis operating at that time as now as the Islamic State. It's all the same. It's all Muslim Brotherhood, right? And really it's because Syria was the end of Obama's Arab Spring project, which was to begin in Tunisia, and the idea was to topple all of these dictators who were trying to make something nearly impossible work. And what's impossible is having a more or less secular, more or less democratic state. Yes, it's a dictator, but the institutions of state were roughly democratic, if you know what I mean by that, as opposed to being a theocratic one where it's all Sharia law and arbitrarily enforced on the street by bearded thugs, right, who have no training in anything except the Quran. The Arab Spring was to take down all these regimes through Iraq and so on, and it was meant to end in Syria, and it was all going to be Islamic. And why did Obama do that? Well, that's a matter of speculation. I think we probably have our own ideas, and most of us are probably right.
Well,
in any
Vlad,
case,
you're bringing me right to
they brought up the Russian thing the same reason the DNC and the Obama administration has brought up anything in the last 8 or 9 years.
Well, I think I just got, oh no, I got kicked off. Oh, great.
Since it appears you're calling back into a live show, we are reconnecting you now.
Clinton's saying that no way her servers could have been hacked. So we know that all of that is nonsense, because suddenly they turn around and say, oh, well, her servers were hacked by the Russians, and the Russians used that information to... now, the fact is that the facts probably are, right? I say this based on just reasoning it out. Not based on reasoning it out on open source information, not from special source information. But we know that she had private servers that were not protected, and we know she had classified information. This is public source. We know the FBI even admitted that. James Comey admitted that, right? So we know the Russians hacked it, because who wouldn't? I mean, hell, half of the audience here would have hacked it if they had the skills, just because, oh my God, we can now know everything we want to know. The Chinese clearly would have hacked it. Any foreign power with the ability to hack it would have hacked it. Not to mention the fact that it's quite reasonable to... Hello?
But this isn't nothing new, They've been doing this for decades, trying to influence other countries' elections.
Say that again? Give me that again, please.
This is the news. They've been doing this for decades. The Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and we do it.
Well, Vlad,
so,
Curtis,
it's definitely political, for the
Can you hear
left
me?
to
Can
act
you hear me
like
out there?
all of a sudden, this is a Russian issue, and
I don't know. Can you hear me out there?
Yeah, I can
hear you now.
Oh, all right. For some reason, I got kicked off. I got kicked out of the chat room. My show, and I'm getting kicked out. I want to make something that was a little odd, because if you remember early in the Obama administration, the Chinese were accused of hacking into our government, not into the DNC or into some private company, but directly into the government on several different levels. And the Obama administration and the Democratic Party blew it off, saying everyone does it. You know, we do it to them, they do it to us, so it's tit for tat. So, you know, no big deal. Don't worry about it. Now, all of a sudden, you have the election coming up, and, well, Hillary loses. It's a huge big deal that someone actually hacked into the DNC. They're not still talking about our government being hacked or the fact that we're hacking other governments. No. It's the DNC, and it's a huge thing. Where is the logic in that, Vlad?
Well, the logic is that it's a classic bait and switch. I mean, really, what they're trying to do is take away the importance of the information presented by Assange and WikiLeaks, who repeatedly and specifically and clearly stated that this information came from inside the DNC, from leakers, and he does not accept hacked information, and none of it was from a state-level actor. But if he had taken state actors' information, which he says he doesn't do, he wouldn't feel any need to defend them as a source. And Assange said this, by the way, in an interview, 3 nights ago. He did an hour with Hannity, right?
Right.
So, and I'm actually padding this out more than I need to. To answer your question directly, this is a bait and switch. And it's a bait and switch because the DNC and the Obama administration wants to take away from the horror of what people have learned and make it look like it's about shooting the messenger. And I think that's a trick that's as old as human speech.
Well,
Never mind what he said. What a terrible person he is for saying that.
Well, I want to bring you back to what you were talking about with Assad, because I pulled out something specifically I wanted to talk to you about dealing with Assad. And there was, which no one has reported on this, Front Page reported on it, and I think WorldNet Daily had carried it also. But there is a recording of Secretary of State John Kerry. He was a conversation with several leaders of Syrian opposition groups, and they were talking about ISIS. And they were saying that, you know, how they were afraid about ISIS growth and so on and so forth. But what it turns out that Kerry told these people was that he and Obama believed that allowing the Islamic State to grow would actually serve the White House's objective in ousting Syrian President Bashar Assad. They planned on allowing ISIS to grow into the monster it is so they can get rid of Assad. And they never counted on Assad going over to Putin and going, hey, buddy, they're screwing us. They are going to, and matter of fact, it traces back to Ambassador Chris Stevens and the attack in the consulate in Benghazi back in 2011. About arms going through that consulate to the opposition to help.
It looks like we lost you again, Annie.
Oh no!
Well, I have a question for Vlad.
But can I answer that one first, though? I actually.
Since it appears you're calling back into a live show, we are reconnecting you now.
Told, and for those people who like horror films, and they're also interested in the history of Islam and its effects on classical civilization. It is an absolutely wonderful movie. It is so much fun, and it's even kind of educational because they get about half of it right, you know. So that movie is Dracula Untold, and Bashar al-Assad specifically says, yes, that they didn't count on him going to Russia, and he goes further. He says he's asked in the interview, "What do you think about the fact that Trump said he might reach out and try to work with Russia to solve the problem?" And Assad said that if they did that, there's a good chance they could solve all the problems in the Middle East. So, Corey, what was your question?
Vlad, I'm back now.
My question is...
I'm back now here because I was actually tying it into the attack in Benghazi, where they're saying that it does prove that Chris Stevens was giving arms to Assad's opposition in order to help propel ISIS forward. And I also want to make one little comment because I happen to love the TV show Tyrant, which was based loosely upon Assad and Syria. So I didn't know if you wanted to comment further on that.
So I don't know that show at all, but I definitely want to comment on Benghazi. And for those people who haven't seen, I think it's called 13 Hours. I watched that over Christmas.
Yes.
And it's very good, and it's even important. Now, the thing is, they managed to make it without directly attacking Clinton or Obama. They made it very carefully. But it's accurate, and the most important parts of that is that there was no protest, and there was no YouTube video. I mean, there was a YouTube video, but it had nothing to do with it. But there was no protest. This was an al-Qaeda attack. Now, to prove what you just said, I'm going to offer you a couple of data points that are indicative that this is true. Shortly before that, or around that time, might have been a little before that, there was an article. You know, they say Washington is a pot that leaks from the top, right? Mm-hmm. And the president has certain ways of influencing policy or getting policy through. And one of them is you float an article somewhere, and then you let everybody know to read that article because, wow, this article is so important and it's so profound. Now, there was an article that came out in The Atlantic, I think it was. I don't remember the name of the author, but he had an East Asian name. And this article, now, the best way to get the details on this is read Stephen Coughlin's paper on it. I believe it's called Burning Down the House. But it might be, or that might be his paper on the CVE, but it's on his website, which is Unconstrained Analytics. That's Stephen Coughlin's website. And in Stephen's article, he details how an article came out about how Al-Qaeda was now the moderate and that Islamic State were the bad guys and that we should be backing Al-Qaeda. And it was very rationally done. If you read this article in The Atlantic, many of you may even remember it. It was called What the Islamic State Really Wants, or What Islam Really Wants, or something. It was what something to do with Islam really wants. Okay, I can't remember whether it was Al-Qaeda or whether it was Islamic State, but it was what the Islamic State or whoever really wants. And it was in The Atlantic, and it was incredibly brilliant, really, really well written and completely full of it. And the whole article and everybody's email box and all the Beltway insiders, you know, all had an instruction. This article's coming out, you got to read it, it's so important. And that was Stephen's cue that probably something was really wrong here, that this was trying to massage through a policy which would otherwise be completely unpalatable to people, which it was. And it was the idea that the people to back, the horse to back in the fight against evil al-Assad was Al-Qaeda, and that we should, and in fact, Clinton almost certainly, and I think this might even be public source now, Clinton almost certainly was using the embassy to move weapons to Islamic terrorist groups in that region, to the Islamic State, and one of these groups went off script and they took out the embassy, and that's what happened. It's just, and if you watch the movie 13 Hours, even though they're careful not to bring too much politics into it, they don't say anything that's untrue, and they do say things you can use to draw your own conclusions. But in any case, there is evidence that what you said is exactly correct. This was about the State Department using, basically, you know, the claim that the United States is behind the Islamic State. I'm sorry, I just think it's true. I find this very discouraging. I don't say this stuff with any joy. I got to tell you, I grew up as a Canadian. This country has always been very left of center, and I haven't been. And I've lost a lot of friends, and I've had a lot of arguments because I've defended the United States as being the greatest force for good in the history of the world, and overall it has been. So it gives me, there's a lot of sorrow in this stuff that I'm saying. I don't like that this is true, but I believe it's true. And I come to these understandings with reluctance. It's not furthering an agenda of mine.
Well, it's funny.
Except the truth.
It's funny you mentioned Stephen Coughlin, because when you were talking about it, I says, wait a minute, I've got that right here. I have the printout, which I printed out months ago, dated February 4th of 2016. It's called Burning Down the House, a strategic overview of the threat, the CVE, and strategic incomprehension in the war on terror. And I put my little notation on here, countering violent extremism, and I've got it highlighted and marked. Yeah, I do refer to this a lot, and I recommend other people. It's an easy download that you can get it in a PDF and save it on your computer. It's got graphs. It talks about everything you should possibly know about protecting the West, and he lays it out. He lays it out fantastically in there.
Well, yes, he really does, and if you search YouTube for Stephen Coughlin CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism. I've interviewed him twice, actually, on this subject, and those videos are out there. And there's other videos about the CVE. Perhaps Kel can remind me of the name of our mutual friend who I've also interviewed, who did a paper. He did a paper about the CVE. Anyway, he's also very good. He lays it out a little bit more simply, but certainly this is something that's important to understand, because the CVE is intellectual sleight of hand by the Obama administration, which is intended to divert funds, in fact, make it nearly impossible to fight Islamic terror, but to look for anything else which might object to Islamic terror, fight back, and make it illegal, and make it the subject of. I mean, we're living in really, really strange times. There is a moral inversion that the left insists on making, and they've been very successful at it. And this is a time of the red pill. This is a time where it's quite important to take some risks and wake people up. Discuss this with people and speak openly. And I'm sorry, I know I'm kind of skipping ahead to to the unasked question, what are we going to do about this? And one of the things we're going to have to do is, I think we have to renormalize the truth. Listen, there was an article that came out the other day about some students. It was in the Vancouver Sun, I think, but it's all over the place now. So there's some students somewhere that insisted that their university no longer teach Plato and Socrates and Aristotle because these are white men, and therefore,
right?
Yeah,
and Shakespeare.
So philosophy should be coming.
And no Shakespeare.
Yes, these people should no longer be taught. Right. Now, of course, the fact that I'd love to see somebody ask them, Karl Marx was a white man, should we also not teach that? And see how they respond. Although my guess is they probably have a prepackaged answer.
What about Sal Alinsky?
Well, Sal Alinsky, exactly.
I know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, of course, they might have a different answer.
Another one that I tell people to always take a look at, this is called The Coming Insurrection, the Invisible Committee. And on the back of it says, all power to the communes. If you want to know their game plan, it's laid out right there, folks. They're telling us what they're going to do, and we're too stupid to do this, to read the information and counter it. But I think this is what we're going to see, which I'm praying that you're right, that Donald Trump is going to do something about it, because he's already talking about outlawing the Muslim Brotherhood here in the United States. You want to see a civil war? Watch him do that.
Well, again, though, the thing about that is that the longer you go without taking these kinds of actions, the worse that war is going to be. Obama is bringing in Muslims and under the guise of being refugees when A, they're not from Syria, B, they are not persecuted groups from where they are. Like he's deliberately not getting Christian Arabs. He's deliberately getting Muslim Arabs and Muslim North Africans. Sorry, and these, this is, if we don't make them Muslim Brotherhood illegal, we don't start the civil war now, we very, very well may lose it. This is, the longer you go without solving a problem like this, the more awful. I mean, I think as we go through these times and I look around and see how things are going, I start to realize why World War II happened. It's because we were just too stupid to do anything about it when we could solve this problem like early at the beginning. Like, I mean, when he went into Poland or when he annexed Czechoslovakia, like early on, we could have just read the book Mein Kampf and gone, this is a problem. Let's stop this. And we didn't. And then we had World War II, and wasn't that awful? And communism too. And we saw the Bolshevik Revolution. We should have read the Communist Manifesto, saw what they were doing, and then said this has to be stopped. And now Islam, we've had 1,400 years of history, and what they do, the way that our people are handling it is not letting us tell the truth in schools. You can't teach, the Muslims are demanding that there's a lot more Islam taught in the schools in the West, and I'm actually in favor of that. The problem is we wouldn't agree on how. I think we need to teach the truth about Islam and what its consequences are to the West and what its real history is. And when I get into discussions with the non-red-pilled, which is, rare because I'm pretty busy at this all the time, but when I get into these discussions with people in meat space, I usually just say, look at real Islamic history. Just read on Islamic history. Read any amount from any source you like of actual Islamic scripture, and then look at the effects of Islam in any place where it is growing in influence. And then honestly tell me that I don't have it right. Because the evidence isn't just there to find, it's overwhelming. We've had to go to great lengths to make it basically illegal to tell the truth about Islam in schools or in public institutions. It's certainly in Canada. If you get up and publicly say things that are true, look what happened to Mark Steyn. All he did was quote a Saudi prince on his book cover, right? Or in his book, he quoted what a Saudi prince said Islam was planning to do. And for that, he was brought in front of the Star Chamber of the Human Rights thingy in Canada. So, you know.
Well, you know, just go to your website and look at the history of St. James, because you sell the crucifix, which I wear every day. Thank you, Kel, for sending me that beautiful gift that people can get at your website for just $30, and listen to the history and the myth about St. James and how, you know, the royalty over there would convert to Islam simply so they can keep their lands and keep their privilege. But if you were a Christian, no, you got to pay all the jizya. You've got to be subjective to Islamic, you know, rules, regulations, laws, and God knows whatever else crap they would be heaping on you. Pick up the book Cervantes, Don Quixote. Read about how he was captured and held, you know, until he was able to ransom himself out. You know, it's been written in literature for centuries, and we still just ignore it.
Yes, in fact, as I understand it, I'm not sure if it's Hungary or another country just east of that, but there's one European country where traditionally they all name their dogs Muslim names because they remember the horror of constantly having to uproot whole villages and hide in the hills from Muslim invaders, and they fought them back off, and they keep that memory alive for the obvious reason that if you don't, you will repeat that history. And, you know, as history teaches us anything, it's that people don't study history, at least not in the West. But Eastern Europeans are fascinating to talk to, especially the ones whose families escaped from behind the Iron Curtain. Because, again, it's like talking to a Lebanese Christian cab driver. You have to convince them that you're not an idiot, and then they will tell you what they really think. And if you talk to East Europeans or Christians from the Middle East, you'll find kindred spirit to counter-jihadis. These people know what we know, and they'll be surprised that you know it, because they've come to Canada or the United States often as a last refuge, and see what's happening. You know, in fact, Canada in some ways, and the United States in some ways, is worse than the Soviet Union. There's an interview with the guy who runs the People's Cube. For those who aren't familiar with it, the People's Cube is a satirical anti-communist website where they report on concurrent events, kind of pretending that it's being done in the Soviet Union in Soviet style, right? And it's very funny. It's called the People's Cube. And that fellow was recently arrested for putting up posters in the university warning people about Islamist groups that were...
Yeah, I got that. That's in my stack of stuff here. I have it because I talked about him and putting up there warning people. And they were doing this, and they're saying, well, you know, you're going against Islam. This is bigoted comments, and they were saying you were defacing the property. And he's using organic paste. It's something that with a little spray bottle of water comes right off. He didn't deface any property. He didn't destroy any property. But they used anything and everything. Here it is. I knew it goes. George Mason University, and the guy's name. He was held on $8,000 bail. Where the hell's the guy's name? Oh, Oleg. I probably cannot pronounce this. Atbashan? That's who you're talking about, right?
I cannot remember. That's what I'm talking about. He's the guy who's the owner, operator, and artist behind the People's Cube, and his name it's a Russian name. He grew up in the Soviet Union, and he'd been stopped by police a couple of times for doing art that was dissident art against the Soviets, and he said he'd never had it as bad in the Soviet Union as he did here. Like, he's facing 5 years in jail, and you know, and now again, the way you explained that actually brings up, I think, a really important point that I think cannot be overstated in terms of its danger. And that is selective enforcement as a tool of Islam and the left. And you know what? I should just keep a book. Whenever I think of an example, I should write it down for times like this, because I'd like to be able to just blow through a list. But essentially, what they do is they use cultural Marxism as a set of laws when it advances cultural Marxism, and they use rule of law that we grew up with as... So in other words, they use whichever works to advance Islam and advance Marxism. Right? So, for instance, they get this guy. They're setting him up for 5 years in jail, not because of what he really did, because that is never, like, people put up posters at that university every day, all over the place, and they never get arrested or face 5 years in jail, even though that may be the maximum fine for these crimes, right? But really, what this is a political crime that they're using the excuse of to face in a private property or whatever have you, right? But you never see a vandal, you never see a vandal who's spray painting stuff that really does take effort to get off, or spray painting on brick that could be a real problem to get off. And you never see them facing 5 years in jail. Probably nothing. Maybe community service, or what the English call an ASBO. Maybe a couple $100 fine. But you'll never see 5 years in jail. You never see that kind of charge being leveled at them, right? So, but if, like, for instance, hate speech is a great example. If you say something true about Islam in a certain manner, you're going to face hate speech, hate crimes, whatever. But if you're a Muslim saying that kill all the infidels, right, you'll never get those charges laid on you. So the problem is that what the left has done is instituted tons and tons of laws which they convince us look reasonable at the time, and then only make sure they're only enforced against the opponents of what their intentions are. And so selective enforcement, I think, is one of the things we all have to be watching out for. It has to be one of those sub-programs you're running in your own brain in the background all the time, looking at how, again, some of these laws appear reasonable on the surface. And we just go along with it because we understand, okay, I see why we need this law, but they're never being enforced against anything that inhibits the advancement of Islam or the far left. And so you pointed out to this fellow what's happened to him as an example of this selected person.
Did we just lose me? Did we lose Vlad?
No, I'm here, I think.
Oh, okay.
Am I here?
I got it.
All right, because we also have a caller coming in here too, Curtis. Let me bring the caller in first, then we can go to your question if you don't mind, okay? Because he just raised his hand a few minutes ago, and he happens to be a friend of the show, a former co-host of mine, Cool Mike. Good afternoon, Cool Mike. Welcome aboard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Annie, glad to hear your husband's doing well. I am Roman Catholic, so a Christian. I am Lebanese, and I drive Uber. So I'm a cab driver. What do you think, in the a great guest, by the way, and my question for him is, in the process of the president and the immigration bringing all Muslims, as you mentioned, from Northern Africa and the Muslim countries, the non-Christian, what is the ultimate goal there? I mean, is to make Sharia law the law of the land, or I guess I don't understand, the ultimate goal of, is it he just feels that America's not accepted? I don't, the puzzle's not falling in place for me on why it's all Muslims, not Christian, Middle East.
Okay, so I understand the question, and I'm going to give you a peculiar answer. I think you do understand. It's just that it's too much to accept. I think especially for Americans to believe that you have a president who has as his goal the destruction of your society, that hates classical civilization, that sees America and England and Canada as colonial powers, as evil, as racist. He sees it in the way that the Frankfurt School people see it. He sees it in the way Saul Alinsky and these people see it. And his job is to bring it down. And what happens after? They don't have an alternate solution other than, I guess, communism, whatever that is. But their goal is to use Muslims as a weapon against classical thought. They are against reason itself. This is a big thing. It's hard to accept. It's taken me, over 10 years of full-time research and study before. And believe me, I don't come to these understandings easily. And if somebody can show me evidence that I'm wrong, I just abandon and apologize immediately for all of it, really. But I think that as an American, and I've had this with even family members who are American, I've had these fights and arguments with them, even though they're on side, because it's so difficult to accept. I mean, as a Canadian, I find it. I'm still not sure about Trudeau, because part of me can't accept that a prime minister would want to do even though he said to the New York Times, and I have that interview here, he said to the New York Times that he looks forward to being the first post-national leader of Canada after it's destroyed as a nation state. He's also a postmodern, and that's why Obama sent his election team up to help get Trudeau elected, and that's why he used the same Islamic connections to drive up the Muslim vote in Canada. In Canada before Trudeau, that never before had Muslims voted at over 30% of their population. And when Trudeau ran for office, it was suddenly over 80%. That had never happened, and he had a secret meeting at a mosque out west, but just shortly before the election with a number of international Islamic leaders, and it was the first meeting he'd ever been to that his main publicist was not allowed to attend, who even remarked on that. He thought, that's odd, it's the first meeting I wasn't allowed to go to, and the only one. And then he gets elected with it, like I say, because suddenly there's this giant influx of Muslim voters. And why would Obama be supporting that? Well, you could look at April 28th, 2009, for anybody who remembers that day. If not, look it up. April 28th, 2009, look for what happened over Manhattan with Air Force One. You'll get a sense of the fact that we're dealing with guys who are postmoderns. They believe in their heart of hearts that Canada, United States, and Western Europe are colonial evil. They just can't. Their history doesn't go before World War One, okay? And they see us as evil, and that our civilizations are racist, and that it's only for white people, and it's all for, and it's got, you gotta, like, to give you kind of an example of this, let's give you a touchy issue, I think, but if I'm able to express it well, I hopefully nobody will be offended, because certainly nobody's meant to be. But if you look at why the left seems to go back and forth on Jewish people as a target of derision, I mean, because anti-Semitism mostly comes from the left. National Socialism, the Nazi Party, was a leftist party. Go watch Hitler's speeches at Nuremberg. He never talked about anything but a classless society and the miracles of socialism. It was a distinctly leftist party. The modern left seems to go back and forth on Jews as a target or not. And the reason is because Jewish people are at times an advantage to the left because they use the identity and usurp the moral authority, the victim narrative of Jewish people from the Holocaust. They will use that authority as a way of advancing a leftist agenda. But Israel as a nation state, and I might add, a nation state with an ethnic identity, which is a Jewish, it's actually a democratic state, and it's as democratic a state as there can be. Both in terms of the way the institutions operate, the electoral system operates, who gets to be a citizen and how, but it identifies itself as specifically a Jewish state. And that's anathema to the left because they're trying to destroy the nation state as an institution. They want international socialism, which is the goal of socialists, right? They want the end of the nation state, and Israel is anathema to them because not only is it a nation state like Canada, the States, or Germany, but it is one which is based on an ethnic identity, and that is intolerable to them, unless, of course, you're China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, right? But it's intolerable to them. It's just sort of a white country and sort of a Jewish one. So you see an attempt at the destruction of the nation state, and Jews as a people are either, depends which group you're talking to, but they're either used as a battering ram against classical civilization, the way black groups are through Black Lives Matter. J Street is an example. There's all kinds of groups where the sort of victim narrative of that group is hijacked by George Soros funded left-wing battering ram against classical civilization. And it's all these different identity groups, whether it's women's groups, alternative sexual lifestyle groups, even to ridiculous degrees where somebody invents a ludicrous sexual orientation for themselves and then demands, that every public institution now has to have 45 different bathrooms. It's really, right, this is all an attempt to bring down the nation state. And Obama really believes this. He believes in the Frankfurt School narrative. He believes that classical civilization is bad. He believes that Plato and Socrates and Aristotle should not be taught. It is about the end of the nation state, and that's why he hates Israel, and that's why he hates the United States, and that's why he's bringing in tons of Muslims. Because there's, pardon me?
Speaking of Israel, how can the West expect Hebrews and Muslims to get along when Muslims can't even get along with themselves? We have Sunni and Shiites, and they've been warring against each other for hundreds of years. And personally, I really think Hebrews and Muslims are never going to get along unless they have some outright war. What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, if you look at the root doctrine for these different groups. The doctrine, this is why I think multiculturalism was a bridge too far. Multiracialism isn't a problem as long as everyone has the same values. But multiculturalism is clearly a problem because that means different values. And what is law but culture? Right? Different cultures have different beliefs in ownership of property, for instance. Classical civilization says that if you go out and get a job or you start a company and you do things honestly and honorably, and that you take that money is yours, and then if you buy things with that money, that thing is yours. But a lot of other cultures don't work that way. Amerindian culture doesn't work that way. Gypsy culture doesn't work that way. Lots of cultures look at property differently. So you simply cannot have different sets of cultures in the same territory, because that means different laws for different people, and that's not workable. You can't function not knowing how the next guy next to you thinks or believes, right? And Islam, of course, has a core set of values that are antithetical to civilization. It's not a different civilization, it's antithetical to it. It's anti-civilization. And the Muslims have at their base as a core belief that they're never going to achieve their Islamic paradise or goals until all the Jews are dead. So it's difficult for me to see how they could get along other than by the suspension. Like if you have some form of Islam that believes that this is in some hypothetical mystical future, then they could get along because they're not taking their religion seriously. But as I say, since the end of colonialism, there was a resurgence of religious Islam as opposed to, I have to say one thing. I'll give one thing for Hillary Clinton. Quite a long time ago, an early WikiLeaks said that she had said quite a while ago that the real distinction was between cultural Muslims and religious Muslims. Religious Muslims were a problem, cultural Muslims were not. Presumably this is an example of what she would say privately, and that would be a private position rather than a public position. But kudos for that, because it's very good. Cultural Muslims are somebody who have, Christmas dinner, at some other time, but religious Muslims are the ones who believe that the only way into paradise is by moving to a non-Muslim land and making it more Muslim, trying to force people to Sharia, or dying in an act of jihad. And there's simply no way that you're going to get along with other groups. It is a supremacist ideology. Muslims always have bloody borders. It's because of the root. Now you can have Irish people and Canadian people and South African people, all kinds of Chinese people, all basically surviving together as different civilizations, because civilizations compete, and competition isn't itself civilized, right? But you simply can't have a supremacist tribal society who believes that its ultimate goal is the death and destruction of the other. There's no getting along. It's true that there are tons of Muslims who live in Israel and like it there and even fight in the Israeli army, but I would call them cultural Muslims because they clearly cannot be obedient to the basic precepts of their scripture.
Well, does
that answer the question?
You bring out a very, very valid point, Vlad, and something that I've been saying on this show for a long number of years, that here in the United States, we have a unique culture that is uniquely American, something that does not exist. And you mentioned this earlier in the show, why America is so fantastic and why it is one of the most powerful governments to ever exist, most wonderful government to be ever created. We're not perfect. We still have our warts, but we are the best that it is in the world at this time. And that's not arrogance talking. That is just basic fact. We were based upon a Judeo-Christian culture upon which our laws were built. And now, with the left attempting to press this multiculturalism, they are attempting to destroy that Judeo-Christian culture. They are trying to use that destruction to destroy our laws, and then to make it a society where you've got a section here for Islam, you've got a section here for the LGBT community. The multiculturalism idea will be the destruction of the United States if we allow it to continue and if we allow these special classes to exist. There should be an American, an unhyphenated American. I don't care if you're male, female, I don't care if you're purple, orange, or chartreuse. You are a simple American, and that's it, and you accept our cultural values and our laws if you want to live here, and this is where we go wrong.
So first of all, I'd like to say that I agree with every word of that, but I would like to add to it, please. And I think it's a very important addition. It is a Judeo-Christian culture from which the laws were based. But a couple of times I've talked about democracy, and I've kind of danced around that term a little bit because I think I'm using it maybe in a proprietary way. But what I mean is that it's Judeo-Christian, but it's also Greco. and I tend to think of it as Greco-Judeo-Christian, because the Greeks came up with it, like we take it for granted. It's the background of our thought process, right? But the Greeks came up with logic and reason. It didn't exist before that. Right? This is a cognitive tool. And so our systems of law are based on the idea of rational determination of evidence. Like, let's look at Sharia law. Sharia law is where a guy can accuse a non-Muslim of blasphemy and then kill him, and there's no consequence. It's where you can kill a woman in your family, as long as she's your wife or daughter, I think. Not mother, I don't think, but wife or daughter. You can kill her, or if it's somebody who spurned you, a lover, someone you liked who spurned you, or somebody that you heard a rumor that she was raped, for instance. You could kill her on an honor crime, and you won't face any consequences under pure Sharia. It's in Reliance of the Traveler, which is the best, most authoritative book on Islamic law in the world, and it's actually written in English because it was written for Muslims outside of the Islamic world. And it's called Reliance of the Traveler. I think it's in Book O Justice. It talks about it's called Killing Without Consequences. It says there may be consequences in the countries you live in their law, but in Sharia, if a woman dishonors Islam, you can kill her. So there's not a lot of evidence required, you see. The idea is that the law was designed in such a way as to advance the authority of Islam and for nothing else, right? In fact, if you want to take all of Sharia law and summarize it in one or two sentences, it would be anything you do that advances the supremacy and authority of Islam is okay, and anything you do against that is not. And that's why you have the guys who did the 9/11 hijackings who were drinking at a strip joint, eating ham sandwiches the night before. Because all is forgiven if you die in an act of jihad. Because what you did to advance the cause of Islam outweighed by 100 million the minor transgressions of eating the wrong food or drinking booze, you see, or going to a strip joint. So, although I'm guessing strip joints are okay in Islam, I'm not sure. So, back to our legal system, right? If you look at our legal system, we have a cornerstone of the British American judicial system is that 10 guilty men can go free before one innocent man go to jail. Well, that means, and also there's a presumption of innocence, and also you need reasonable doubt, and also you need to have, the O.J. Simpson trial notwithstanding, you need to have scientific reason to show that this person is guilty. You need to produce evidence that is not hearsay, that is not based on the kind of fabrications tribal societies like Islamic societies use, right? This is entirely Greek. Much of our civilization comes from Greek thought. And even Christianity, and Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the greatest thinkers in world history, who was a profound Catholic thinker, was very clear about science and examining the natural world using natural science, natural philosophy as a tool for understanding the universe and to go forward. You know, that people don't know this, but the Catholic Church, it's on the Vatican's own website. The Catholic Church actually says that evolution is the way that people came to be here, not intelligent design and not creation. If you read the Bible right, it says it'll agree with that. I'm not sure about that last part. It does say that. Vatican website says that. I personally don't really get how those two jive. But what's interesting is that the Catholic Church, who supported Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, and actually did support Galileo till they had a political disagreement with him. So the fact is that the Catholic Church has always been very pro-science, right? And the Jews, of course, it's actually the one religion and religious doctrine I know the least about. But if you look at Israel, which is a Jewish state, and you look at the Jewish people around the world, their contributions to science are absolutely out of proportion to the percentage of the population, which means that clearly, according to the root doctrine of Jewish culture and, I guess, religion, there is no problem with using reason as a tool for determining the rightness or wrongness of a thing, the guilt or innocence of a thing, the value of a thing, not to mention the development of science, and then the application of science for compassionate reasons like medicine and so on, right? Where Islam has none of that, and other tribal societies have none of that. So the United States, as I said earlier, has been the greatest source of good in the history of the world, and that includes things that low information sort of political amateurs might think of as bad things, like the fact that the United States completely and utterly dominates, until Obama, utterly dominates the world's oceans. Well, why would I say that's a good thing? Because it's allowed trade. And trade means that since the United States has become a dominant force, everywhere in the world has gotten richer. And the places where they're not getting richer, they're not getting poorer. Where there is famine, it's because that famine was imposed by an act of war by somebody else. Now that the Chinese are starting to take control of certain portions of the oceans through artificial islands and heavy militarization, I bet you're going to see problems in Taiwan and problems in that region. You're going to see things that didn't happen when the United States controlled those oceans. But the United States has because it's a product of Greek thought and Judeo-Christian thought, has consistently made a world where things got better. They had a war to end slavery, as did the British. They've had a number of wars or other military actions that were to prevent larger wars. Again, keeping the oceans free for trade means that people have the opportunity to enrich themselves, to grow a surplus of food and trade it with other people with surpluses. These are great things. And you look at the Marshall Plan, for instance, and the similar plan they implemented in Japan after World War II allowed Germany and Japan, which had been countries that were absolutely annihilated after World War II, to become great economic powers. So these are the actions of the state which, if history is allowed to be kept after the current era we're in, if any truth is allowed to be told, and that's looking doubtful, the United States really would be Reagan's shining city on a hill.
Well, I'll give you a little thing of hope here. We're coming down to our last 7 minutes, so we're going to start wrapping up here. But there is a ray of hope because there is a phenomenon that is going on here in the United States, and it's caused by the backlash because of what we have seen of liberal education in our system for generations. And it's starting to turn around. You're having a large growth of classical Christian or classical religious schools coming. And henceforth, that is spilling over into the public sector. So a lot of public school systems are starting to take classical education. They may take the religious element out of it, so you're not teaching, say, Catholicism or Anglicanism or Judaism. You may be teaching about that religion, but you are not preaching that religion. That is the difference. So they're using that same format. Now, Texas is one of the fastest growing areas in this. And what Texas does, the rest of the nation then follows. So there is a growing movement to bring back classical education and critical thought. So there is going to be, it'll take a couple of generations for this to fully come around full circle, but there is hope. And I think with the Trump administration coming in, with the revamping of the education from the government up, while this is going down from the local level, from the government down and then from the local level up, it'll meet in the middle, and I think that we shall see our nation turn around. There is hope.
It will if that happens, but we're going to have to fight for that. I think we have to, the first thing to do, I think, is to normalize the truth around the water cooler. I mean, we have to be comfortable saying things that we know are true. A couple of times I've alluded to what I call the tragedy of the intellectual commons. And what I mean by that is we've withdrawn saying things we know are true because they're considered impolite now, and now we can't say them at all. If we do, we're called horrible names. It's essentially illegal. And the first thing we have to do is take back that territory. We have to just comfortably, calmly say things that are true about Islam and about communism, which are considered impolite now. And we're going to have to pay price for that initially. But I don't know about you, and I don't know about your other listeners. I know for me, over the course of the 10 or 12 years I've been doing this, that every few months I get a call from an old friend who cut me out of their life or called me horrible names. Or they now take me out to dinner or bring over a couple of beers and say, you know what, I got to tell you, it turns out you're right about all that. And my life was more difficult, and there's no schadenfreude in that admission by them. It's only data points to me. I mean, I've lost years of my life with less social enjoyment and so on and so on and so on. But the fact is that that's what fighting means. Fighting means taking risks and there's going to be losses. And I think one of the things each one of us can do as individuals, and again, not to say it angrily, not to say these things petulantly or angrily or even forcefully, but in the most natural manner, the way you would talk about the weather, say, oh my goodness, I've noticed the city is becoming full of religious Muslims. That's going to be a problem because everywhere Islam goes, it makes places less liberal and worse for everybody, even Muslims. This has to be fought. We have to be comfortable saying that in calm terms, and you will be ostracized and people will call you names. And, you're going to maybe, obviously you can't afford to lose your career, your income over that, but be prepared to lose some of it. because if we don't do that, we're going to lose all of it. So anyway, that's I guess what I got to say on that. Look, I know you're down to the last 5 minutes. Could I just take this opportunity to thank you for having me on your show? I got to tell you, this is a wonderful panel of people. I've really enjoyed it. You guys are fantastic, and it's people like you and shows like this that give me hope that maybe we can turn this thing around.
And I bet you're surprised that all those articles you were talking about, I had them right here sitting on the desk right next to me. And we only spoke for you and I only spoke for less than 2 minutes last night, and we didn't even say specifically what we were going to talk about. We just glossed over. So I'm glad I was well prepared. And you're welcome back. I will have you back on the show. You'll probably be a freaking guest. I said that to all of them, but I get so many great guests. I have to start making a list of who to start recycling. But Vlad, I'm going to tell everyone to go to your blog, which is Vlad Tepes blog. There's a link on the show page. So people, vast majority, listen to the podcast later on. They can just, as they're listening, click on it and go and see what it's all about. Cal, I'm sorry we didn't have more of you chiming in, but I do believe you have a show going on tonight. Put it in the chat room. They can find you on Red Fox Radio and Global Patriot Radio here on BTR, correct?
Well, primarily what I want to share with the listeners is that Vlad Tepes joins me at Infidels Are Watching, courtesy of Global Patriot Radio and American Patriot Radio, the last Tuesday of every month at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Vlad, it was an honor and a pleasure.
Thanks, Kelly. You too, and I'll catch up with you all later. So I'm just gonna log off and try to attend to a couple of small things here. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to the show. I really enjoyed it. If you ever want to bring me back, you never have to ask twice. Okay?
Okay, great. And Curtis, I want to thank you for being with us today. I'm sorry I cut you off a couple of times, but with my chat room going down and Skype kicking me out so many times, I sometimes couldn't follow the conversation, and I had certain points I wanted to get across. But Curtis, you're on your next book. You're on book number 24, right?
Yeah.
Hi.
And matter of fact, I'm on page, I think it's 75. So I hope to finish it by March, and it's going to be a monster blockbuster.
Oh, excellent. So people can check you at theoriginalradicals.com. We come to the end of the show, and we will be back. We've got two great guests joining us this Friday. Kel, your friend, Dr. P.J. Sloan, is going to be joining us. And we also have Dr.
90
Pierce.
Seconds.
So we're going to have two great guests on Friday. And then next week, Curtis, your friend George Farrell is going to join us. And Rodney Lee Conover, who was supposed to be with us before the New Year, because BTR did not let him call in, kept on telling him that there's no show on while we were live on the air. He's going to be joining us. I don't know what we're going to do on the 20th, because as it stands now, I will be in D.C. if all goes
60
well.
seconds.
With my girlfriend here, Barbara is going to be going with me to the inauguration. I've got the tickets. I've got to pick them up on Thursday. And depending upon what happens with my husband, whether or not he'll be home or he'll still be in this other facility, I'm planning on being there. So on the 20th, Curtis, it may be just you, Kel, and whoever else you drag in from out off the street. Cool Mike is listening in. Maybe he'll decide to join you guys. And if I can, I'll call in from D.C. while I'm there. So there's a lot happening.
I'll get with your co-host on that. We have some big fire coming down the here in Michigan. We got a boogie, but the progressives are trying to take over our state after getting whooped at the federal level. But anyway, we'll talk more. Annie, as always, man, you're the best.
Well, I thank you. We're down to our last few seconds here. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We will be back here Friday, same bat time, same bat station. So until then, I say good night and God bless. No time for a closing song. So until then, I'll see you all.
All right.
Thank you for using Blog Talk Radio. Goodbye.